The city burned, stone cracked, timber roared. The ancient walls of Cintra, which had stood against northern winds and southern armies for generations beyond counting, came down in a single night. The defenders died at their posts. The gates splintered, and in the highest tower of the palace, a child with ashen hair felt something inside her break open, like a door that had never been meant to close. Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon was 10 years old when the world ended. She did not yet understand what moved in her blood. The power that had passed through her mother Pavetta, that had manifested once in a storm of raw force at a betrothal feast years before, now lived in her hen Iker. The elves had called it in ages long faded. Elder blood, a genetic memory written in flesh, descended from an elven sorceress named Lara Dorren, Ip Shiadal, who had loved a human mage and bound their bloodlines together. The gift allowed those who carried it to step between worlds as easily as crossing a threshold, to bend space, to fracture time. Ciri knew none of this. She knew only that her grandmother was dying, that the palace reeked of smoke and blood, and that somewhere in the chaos, people were screaming her name. The Nilfgaardian army had breached the inner keep 4 days after the Battle of Marnadal crushed the last of Cintra's forces. Queen Calanthe, mortally wounded in that final stand, had dragged herself back to the capital with what remained of her soldiers, too few to mount a defense, too proud to surrender. The nobles gathered in the great hall. The servants were sent to the crypts, and when the Nilfgaardian mages shattered the enchanted gates with spells that lit the night sky like false dawn, Calanthe gave her final order. Poison. Mothers killed their children first, quickly, tenderly. Then the men ended the women, and then themselves. Better that than Nilfgaardian chains. Better that than seeing Cintra's daughters sold south to the arenas and brothels of the empire. The court of Cintra died as it had lived, defiant, unyielding. Calanthe herself could not drink the cup. Her hands shook too badly from her wounds. She asked those nearest to finish it, to give her the mercy of a blade, but no one had the courage to strike their queen. So she walked to the tower window, looked out over the burning city one last time, and stepped into empty air. They said later that she had thrown herself down in despair. They said many things that were not true. Ciri was not there to see it. By then, hands had already pulled her through corridors thick with smoke, down passages she had played in as a child, out through a servant's door that opened onto streets choked with rubble and fleeing shapes. Someone, accounts differ on who, thrust her toward the city's edge, toward the forest, toward anywhere that was not here. What those accounts agree upon is this: a Nilfgaardian knight in black armor, his face hidden behind a visor shaped like the sun in eclipse, found the girl as Cintra guards attempted to flee the city with her. His name was Cahir Maur Difrin Epsialach. He had been ordered to capture her. He succeeded. The battle was brief and brutal. Cintra guards died. Nilfgaardian soldiers fell. When the chaos settled, only Cahir and the terrified child remained. He picked her up. She screamed. Then darkness took her. When Ciri woke, she was no longer in the burning city. Cahir had escaped with her into the countryside. He did not speak her language. She did not speak his. The barrier between them was more than linguistic. It was the barrier between captor and captive, between the knight who had helped destroy her world and the girl who had lost everything. That night, when Cahir finally slept from exhaustion, Ciri made her choice. She ran. Into darkness. Into forests. Into whatever future awaited those who fled alone with nothing but terror for company. Cahir would report her escape, would face consequences for his failure, but that came later. In that moment, Ciri simply put distance between herself and the Black Knight, moving through wilderness that cared nothing for her survival. The wilderness beyond Cintra's walls was not kind to refugees. Forests that had seemed peaceful in daylight revealed themselves as mazes of thorn and shadow once the sun fell. Streams that had sparkled in summer now ran cold and black, and everywhere, the sounds of pursuit, not always real, not always human, but constant. She walked because there was nothing else to do. Her clothes, once fine garments befitting a princess, grew stained with mud and ash. Her feet blistered. Hunger became a companion that never left thirst worse. She drank from streams without knowing if the water was safe. She ate berries without knowing if they would poison her. She survived because children sometimes do. not through skill, but through the dumb luck of youth that has not yet learned to fear the world properly. How long she wandered, no record clearly states. Days, perhaps a week. Time loses meaning for the lost. She moved north, away from the Nilfgaardian advance. The Empire's armies had turned their attention to consolidating their hold on Cintra's ruins and preparing to push further into the northern kingdoms. They would come for Sodden next. They would come for everywhere, eventually. But for now, the forests and hills north of the fallen capital remained relatively empty of soldiers. Empty of soldiers did not mean empty of danger. Beasts that smelled smoke and death on the wind grew bold. Bandits who understood that war creates refugees, and refugees often carry what little wealth they manage to salvage, watched the roads, and stranger things moved in the deep woods. Creatures that had no interest in human conflicts, but little patience for human intrusion. Ciri learned to hide at the sound of footsteps, learned to go still when branches cracked nearby, learned that cold and hunger were preferable to discovery. She did not yet know how many hunted her. The Emperor of Nilfgaard wanted her for reasons that tangled bloodline and prophecy together into purposes dark enough to sicken those who understood them fully. Bounty hunters and spies had been dispatched even before Cintra fell. Mages with their own agendas whispered her name in towers far from the battlefield, and in places further still, in dimensions she could not have conceived of, beings ancient and alien had begun to take notice of the ripple her bloodline made in the fabric of reality. But these were hunters who would come later. In those first desperate days, Ciri's enemies were simpler: cold, hunger, exhaustion, the fundamental hostility of a world that cared nothing for the survival of one small girl. She might have died in those woods. Many did. The forest called Brokilon had stood since before humans came to the continent. Its trees grew so thick that sunlight reached the forest floor only in scattered fragments. Its paths shifted. Its depths held secrets that the unsightly elves, the elder race who had ruled before humanity's arrival, still remembered but no longer spoke of freely. And its guardians, the dryads, permitted no trespass. Brokilon's borders were inviolate. Those who entered without permission did not return, or if they did return, they returned changed, transformed. The dryads had their own ways of replenishing their numbers, and human girls who wandered too deep into the forest sometimes emerged as something other than what they had been. Ciri stumbled into Brokilon's outer reaches without understanding where she was. She only knew that the trees here grew larger than any she had seen, that the silence felt different, heavier, that something in the air made her skin prickle with a warning her conscious mind could not yet articulate. She was being watched. The dryads had marked her presence the moment she crossed the threshold. They knew her for human. They knew her for prey. Whether they would kill her or claim her remained to be seen. And then something else found her first. The creature had many names in many languages: scolopendromorph in the clinical terminology of scholars, Arrakis in some regional dialects, giant centipede in the blunt language of those who had seen one and survived. It was long as 3 horses placed end to end, with armor of chitinous plates that turned aside arrows, and mandibles that could shear through leather and flesh with equal ease. It dropped from the canopy onto the forest floor 20 paces ahead of Ciri. She froze. The thing's eyeless head swiveled toward her. It tasted the air with sensors humans did not possess, reading her terror like words on a page. Then it moved. Ciri ran. Not because she thought she could escape, not because she had any plan beyond the animal imperative to flee from death. She simply ran because that was what remained when thought had been burned away by pure fear. The creature pursued. Its many legs carried it across the uneven forest floor, faster than any human could sprint. It closed the distance. Ciri stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. The thing's breathing, if it could be called breathing, made a sound like wind through hollow reeds. Closer. An arrow took it in the joint between 2 armor plates, then another. The scolopendromorph reared back, mandibles clacking, trying to locate its attacker. A figure moved in the branches above, then another. Ciri caught only impressions green, leather, the fluid grace of beings who moved through the forest as if they were part of it. A third arrow, larger than the others, punched through the creature's head and pinned it to an ancient oak. The thing thrashed, died, went still. Ciri stood shaking, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. A woman dropped from the canopy. Not a woman, a dryad. Her skin held a faint greenish cast, her hair the color of honey, her eyes the deep brown of forest soil. She wore leather and carried a bow of wood that looked grown rather than carved. Behind her, another figure approached, larger, male, white-haired, a witcher. Geralt of Rivia had entered Brokilon for his own reasons that involved messages from kings and negotiations with dryad queens. He had not expected to find a child being hunted by monsters, but when he heard the screams, instinct older than thought had sent him running toward the sound. The dryad who had killed the creature was called Brian. She spoke to Geralt in the elder speech, quick words Ciri could not follow. Geralt responded in kind, his accent different but understandable to Brian's ears. Then both of them turned to look at the girl. Ciri met the Witcher's gaze. His eyes were amber, inhuman, but not cruel. He asked her name. She told him. She told him she was from Cintra, though Cintra no longer existed. She did not tell him she was Ciri the princess. She introduced herself with the diminutive form, the child name, hoping it would protect her somehow, hoping anonymity might be safer than truth. Geralt tilted his head slightly, studying her. Something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or suspicion, but he did not press. Brian spoke again. Her words were sharp, Geralt's response sharper. They were arguing, though Ciri could not follow the substance of it. Finally, Brian made a gesture that seemed to be equal parts resignation and command. They would take the girl deeper into Brokilon, to see the lady. The dryads called their queen Ithne. She ruled from a place called Dwencanel, a name that meant singing waters in the old speech. It was not a city. The dryads built nothing that resembled human architecture. Instead, they shaped the forest itself, coaxing trees to grow in patterns that created shelter, pathways, gathering places. The ancient oaks and cedars of Brokilon responded to their touch in ways that seemed less like cultivation and more like conversation. Ciri walked between Geralt and Bronn. Other dryads moved in the branches overhead. Arrows knocked, watching. The Witcher seemed unconcerned by this. He walked with the easy confidence of someone who had negotiated these woods before and survived. Ciri's mind spun with questions she dared not ask. Who was this man? Why had he helped her? Where were they taking her? And beneath those questions, a deeper one. Would she ever leave this forest? The stories about Brokilon were not kind. The forest took girls. The forest changed them. Human daughters went in. Dryads came out. The process was said to involve water from a sacred pool. Water that erased memory and remade identity. Ciri had heard these tales from her grandmother's court, told as warnings to keep young women from wandering near the forest's edge. She had not imagined she would test their truth. Dwencanel revealed itself gradually. First, the sound of water. Then, clearings where sunlight actually reached the ground. Then, the trees themselves, grown in configurations that suggested purpose. And finally, at the heart of it, a woman. Ithne was ancient. How ancient, none could say with certainty. Dryads did not age as humans did. They measured their lives in seasons beyond counting. And Ithne had been queen of Brokilon since before the last human kingdom rose on the continent's northern edge. Her face was ageless. Her eyes held the weight of centuries. She looked at Ciri and saw too much. Geralt spoke first. He explained, in the common tongue now for Ciri's benefit, that the girl had been fleeing something, that she was alone, that she required sanctuary. Ithne's response was measured. Brokilon did not offer sanctuary lightly. The forest was not a refuge for every lost child. Those who entered its heart either became part of the forest, or they did not leave at all. She asked Ciri questions. Where was she from? Where were her parents? What had she been running from? Ciri answered carefully. She admitted Cintra. She admitted her family was dead. She did not admit who her grandmother had been, did not speak the names that would identify her as more than just another refugee from a fallen kingdom. Ithne studied her in silence. Then the Dryad Queen said something that Ciri would remember for the rest of her life, though she did not fully understand it then. The girl carries something old in her blood. Geralt went very still. Old how? He asked. Old as the elves. Older, perhaps. I can feel it, like a wound in the air around her. The Witcher's expression remained neutral, but Ciri saw something flicker in those amber eyes. Concern, or recognition. Ethne declared that the child could stay in Brokilon, for a time, until it became clear whether she would remain by choice, or whether circumstances would pull her elsewhere. The dryads would protect her while she healed, while she rested, while the world outside continued its wars and chaos without her. It was not freedom, but it was safety. For now. Geralt left Brokilon 3 days later. He had business elsewhere, messages to carry, contracts to fulfill. The life of a Witcher did not permit extended stays in any one place, even one as relatively safe as the Dryad Forest. Before he departed, he spoke with Ciri briefly. He told her she would be protected here. He told her the Dryads could be trusted, within limits. He did not tell her that he suspected who she really was, did not tell her that the law of surprise bound them together in ways she could not yet understand, did not tell her that he would return. He simply left. Ciri watched him go with a child's uncomplicated grief at being abandoned by the first person who had shown her kindness since Cintra fell. She did not know then that he left because he always left, that Geralt of Rivia was a man who walked away from everything, even destiny, especially destiny, because he believed himself cursed to bring death to those he cared for. She could not have understood that his leaving was not rejection, but something sadder. The self-imposed exile of someone who believed the world would be better off without him in it. The Dryads gave her shelter, food, clean water. They tended her blistered feet and fed her stews made from forest herbs. Bran, the honey-haired Dryad who had killed the scolopendromorph, checked on her each day. She was not unkind, but she was not human either, and the gulf between them remained. Ciri tried to adapt, tried to learn the rhythms of Brokilon, but at night, when sleep came, she dreamed of burning cities and falling grandmothers and streets running with blood. The power in her blood remained quiet, for now, but those who hunted her had not stopped searching. Nilfgaard's spies asked questions in every village. Between Cintra's ruins and the northern forests, bounty hunters followed rumors of a girl with ashen hair, and in towers far away, mages scried and calculated and plotted. Cirilla of Cintra had disappeared, but the elder blood could not hide forever. The Witcher's Keep stood where no sane architect would have placed it. Kaer Morhen. The name meant Keep of the Elder Sea, in a language older than the kingdoms that now warred across the continent. It perched in the Blue Mountains like a broken tooth, its towers crumbling, its walls scarred by an assault that had occurred decades before Ciri was born. Winter held the mountains 8 months of the year. The paths leading to the fortress were treacherous even in good weather, and the valley in which it sat remained perpetually shadowed, as if the sun itself had decided the place was best left in darkness. This was where Geralt brought her. Not immediately, not directly from Brokilon. The journey from the Dryad Forest to the mountain keep took weeks, and the route twisted through territories where Nilfgaardian patrols and Scoia'tael partisans made travel dangerous for anyone Geralt moved carefully. He avoided the main roads. He kept the girl hooded when they passed through villages. He told those who asked that she was his niece, his ward, his responsibility. He did not tell them her name. Ciri had learned by then that her name carried weight, that speaking it aloud invited attention she could not afford. The fall of Cintra had made her valuable in ways that had nothing to do with who she was as a person and everything to do with what she represented: royal bloodline, political legitimacy, the last living connection to a kingdom that, though destroyed, still held symbolic power in the minds of those who had opposed Nilfgaard's expansion. And there was the other thing, the thing in her blood that Ethne had sensed, the thing that made Geralt's jaw tighten whenever he looked at her too long, the thing that Ciri herself did not yet understand, but could feel sometimes, like pressure building behind her eyes before a storm. They reached Kaer Morhen in late autumn. The valley was already preparing for winter. The few trees that grew at this altitude had shed their leaves. The stream that ran past the keep's foundations ran cold and clear, fed by snowmelt from peaks that never fully thawed, and the fortress itself loomed above them like a monument to some war long forgotten. Ciri stared up at it and felt small. Geralt led her across a stone bridge, through gates that no longer closed properly, into a courtyard where dead leaves gathered in corners, and the wind made sounds like voices. She had expected grandeur. Instead, she found decay. The keep's western tower had collapsed entirely. Entire sections of wall stood open to the elements. What remained was a skeleton of its former self, maintained just enough to provide shelter for those who still called it home. Those who still called it home were few. An old man emerged from the main hall, white-haired, though not from age. His face was weathered in ways that spoke of decades exposed to wind and combat. His eyes were the same amber as Geralt's. He moved with the careful economy of someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt multiple times. Vesemir. He was the oldest of the Wolf School Witchers. Some said he had been at Kaer Morhen since its founding. Others claimed he had trained the trainers. The truth lay somewhere in between. What was certain was this: Vesemir had survived the pogrom that destroyed most of the Witchers a generation ago, and he had dedicated what remained of his life to preserving what little knowledge and tradition could be salvaged from that catastrophe. He looked at Ciri with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been resignation. "This is her, then," Vesemir said. "Not a question." "Yes," Geralt replied. "She's younger than I expected." "They usually are." Vesemir nodded slowly. He studied the girl the way one might study a horse at market, assessing potential and problems with equal weight. Then he grunted and turned back toward the hall. "Get her inside. Winter's coming early this year." The great hall of Kaer Morhen smelled of wood smoke and old stone. A fire burned in the central hearth, its light pushing back shadows that seemed reluctant to retreat entirely. Tapestries hung on the walls, their images faded to near illegibility. Tables that had once seated dozens now held only a handful of occupants. The space had been built for an order of warriors. What remained was a ghost of that ambition. 3 other Witchers sat near the fire. Lambert, young by Witcher standards, perhaps 30 years in appearance, though his actual age was difficult to determine. He had the look of someone perpetually annoyed by the world's refusal to meet his low expectations. His greeting to Ciri consisted of a grunt and a return to whatever he had been carving with a knife, too sharp for the work. Eskel, older and quieter. A scar ran down the right side of his face, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-smile that did not reach his eyes. He nodded to Ciri with something approaching warmth, which, in the context of Witchers, amounted to not actively projecting hostility. And Cohen, who was not of the Wolf School, but had sought shelter at Kaer Morhen during the winter months, when his own travels took him through the Blue Mountains. He wore the Griffin medallion of his school, but the Griffins had scattered years ago. He was, like all of them, a remnant of something larger that had been systematically destroyed. They looked at Ciri. She looked back. None of them seemed certain what to do with a child. Witchers were made, not born. The process that created them involved mutagens and magic and survival rates so low that only a handful of candidates ever completed the transformation. Boys were brought to the keeps young, before they had fully formed opinions about their own mortality. They were subjected to the trials. Most died. Those who survived emerged changed, faster, stronger, with senses that perceive the world in ways baseline humans could not match. They did not train girls. The mutagens worked differently in female physiology. The survival rate dropped from dismal to effectively 0. A few schools had tried. Decades ago, the experiments had ended in tragedy. So the tradition held. Boys only. And even then, only a small fraction survived. Ciri was not here to become a Witcher. That much Geralt had made clear to Vesemir. The girl would not undergo the trials. She would not be given the mutagens. But she would be trained. She would learn to fight, to survive, to control whatever power moved in her blood. Because something did move in her blood. Vesemir had sensed it immediately, the way Ethne had. A subtle wrongness. Not evil, not corrupting, but present. A quality to her that did not match the baseline human pattern. He had seen many things in his long life. This was new. They fed her that first night. Stew made from mountain goat and root vegetables. Bread that was hard but edible. Water from the stream, cold enough to make her teeth ache. The Witchers ate in silence, which seemed to be their natural state. Ciri tried to match them, but exhaustion and stress had worn through her capacity for stoicism. She wept, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears that she could not stop, running down her face while she chewed bread and tried to pretend she was fine. Eskel looked away, giving her privacy. Lambert rolled his eyes but said nothing. Cohen pretended to find something fascinating about his empty bowl. Geralt stared into the fire as if it held answers to questions he had not asked. Only Vesemir spoke. "You're safe here," he said. "For now. That will have to be enough." Winter closed over the mountains like a fist. The snow came in the night, silent and absolute. By morning, the valley had disappeared beneath white. The paths down the mountain became impassable. The world contracted to the boundaries of the keep, and the few outbuildings that still stood. They were sealed in until spring. This was when the training began. Ciri had expected swords. She received pain instead. Vesemir started with the basics: conditioning, endurance, teaching her body to move in ways it had not been designed to move. She ran laps around the courtyard until her lungs burned and her legs buckled. She did exercises whose purpose she could not understand. She fell. She got up. She fell again. The Witchers watched with the detached interest of craftsmen observing raw material. Lambert made jokes about her form. Eskel offered occasional corrections that were always phrased as suggestions rather than commands. Cohen said little but watched everything, his eyes tracking her movements with the analytical precision of someone who understood that survival often depended on seeing patterns others missed. Geralt did not train her directly those first weeks. He observed. He spoke with Vesemir in low tones. He disappeared for days at a time to hunt or patrol the perimeter of the valley. When he was present, he seemed uncomfortable, as if proximity to the child reminded him of something he preferred to avoid. Ciri began to understand that Geralt of Rivia was a man at war with himself. He had claimed her through the law of surprise, an ancient custom that bound savior and saved in ways that approximated family. But he did not want a family, did not believe himself capable of providing what a child needed. And beneath that reluctance lay something darker, a conviction that everyone he cared for eventually suffered for that connection. So he kept distance between them even when they occupied the same space. Ciri, for her part, focused on survival. The training was brutal, not because the Witchers were cruel, but because they knew no other way. Their own childhoods had been forged in pain and transformation. They taught what they knew. What they knew was how to turn soft flesh into something harder. She learned to fall without breaking. She learned to roll, to absorb impact, to keep moving even when her body screamed for rest. She learned the geography of pain, which aches were dangerous and which were merely the price of progress. She learned that the Witchers would push her exactly to the edge of her limits, but not beyond, because they had no interest in permanently damaging what they were trying to build. Weeks passed. The snow deepened. The temperature dropped. The world outside Kaer Morhen ceased to exist in any meaningful way. There was only the keep, the training, the long nights by the fire while the Witchers told stories about hunts and monsters and contracts gone wrong. Ciri listened. She learned the bestiary through their tales, ghouls that fed on battlefields, neckers that swarmed in packs, wraiths that formed from violent death and could not be killed by normal means, vampires that came in varieties ranging from mindless to sophisticated, Lashans that were forests given malevolent consciousness, fiends that could break a horse's back with a single strike. The world, she learned, was full of things that wanted to kill her. She asked once why the Witchers were hated if they protected humans from these creatures. Lambert laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Because we're not human," he said. "Not anymore. And humans fear what they can't understand more than they fear the things trying to eat them." Eskel added more gently, "And because we charge for our services, people resent paying for their own survival." Cohen simply said, "Fear and gratitude are poor companions. One always drives the other out." The Witchers had been persecuted, their keeps burned, their traditions destroyed by mobs who decided that mutants were as dangerous as the monsters they hunted. The wolf school had survived by retreat into these mountains. Other schools had scattered. Some had been wiped out entirely. Ciri began to understand that she had found sanctuary among outcasts, that these men knew what it meant to be hunted for what you were rather than what you had done. Spring came late to the mountains. The snow began to recede in fits and starts, revealing a landscape that looked freshly wounded: dead branches, exposed stone, the debris of winter's occupation. The stream swelled with meltwater. The paths down the mountain remained treacherous but passable. And with the thaw came visitors. A sorceress arrived in mid-spring, traveling by portal because sorceresses disdained walking when magic provided faster alternatives. Her name was Triss Marigold. She was young, though with mages that meant little. Sorceresses and sorcerers age slowly, if at all, and their apparent youth often concealed centuries of accumulated experience. Triss did not have centuries. She was perhaps 30, perhaps younger, but she had fought at the Battle of Sodden Hill, where the mages of the north had thrown back Nilfgaard's advance at terrible cost. She had been burned by enemy magic. The scars remained visible on her chest, a reminder that power did not grant immunity to consequence. She came at Geralt's request. Ciri needed education beyond what the Witchers could provide. She needed to learn letters and numbers, history and politics, and most importantly, she needed someone who understood magic to assess what moved in her blood. Triss brought books, writing materials, patience that the Witchers lacked. She set up a small classroom in one of the keep's side chambers, away from the training yard. Here, surrounded by musty text and flickering candles, Ciri learned the things a young noblewoman was expected to know: writing, mathematics, geography, the lineages of the northern kingdoms, and how they interconnected through marriage and alliance. But Triss also taught other things. She explained what magic was, how it worked, how it differed from the signs that Witchers used, which were crude approximations of true spellcraft. She described chaos, the underlying force that sorcerers and sorceresses learned to manipulate through will and training. She spoke of sources, individuals born with natural conduits to that power, who could wield magic instinctively but struggled to control it. And she tested Ciri, simple exercises, attempting to light a candle through will alone, trying to sense the flow of chaos in the room, meditative techniques designed to awaken latent abilities. Ciri failed all of them, or seemed to. Triss frowned. She sensed something in the girl. All the mages who had encountered Ciri reported the same thing: a presence, a potential. But when tested directly, nothing manifested. The power refused to respond to conventional methods. Perhaps she's not a source, Triss suggested to Geralt one evening. She is, Geralt replied with certainty. Then it's blocked, or dormant, or tied to something specific we haven't identified, or dangerous. Triss did not argue with that assessment. They both knew what happened when sources lost control. Buildings leveled, people killed. Reality itself sometimes fractured in ways that took years to repair. If Ciri carried that kind of power, and it activated without training, without control, the consequences would be catastrophic. So they proceeded carefully. Triss focused on theory rather than practice, teaching Ciri the frameworks for understanding magic without asking her to actually use it, building a foundation for later, when the time came, if the time came. Ciri absorbed the lessons with the same intensity she brought to sword training. She asked questions that revealed a mind hungry for understanding. She made connections between concepts that impressed Triss despite herself. The girl was intelligent, perhaps dangerously so, but the power in her blood remained silent. Summer came. The mountains grew green. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadows below the keep. The Witchers prepared to disperse for the hunting season, when contracts would be available and coin could be earned. They would return in autumn before the first snows trapped them again. Ciri's training had progressed to swords, not full blades yet, wooden practice weapons, but swords nonetheless. Vesemir taught her the basic guards and cuts, how to stand, how to move, how to perceive the geometry of combat as a puzzle to be solved rather than chaos to be survived. She was not good, not yet, but she was learning, and learning was enough. Geralt still kept his distance, still treated her as a ward rather than anything closer. But on rare occasions, Ciri caught him watching her practice with an expression she could not interpret: pride, perhaps, or fear, or both. She wanted to ask him why he had claimed her, why he had invoked the law of surprise all those years ago, why he had returned to Cintra when it burned, Why he had brought her here to this broken fortress instead of leaving her with the dryads or delivering her to some distant relative who might have taken her. But she did not ask, because part of her feared the answer would be that he had no answer, that it had been accident and obligation rather than choice, that she was a responsibility he resented rather than a daughter he wanted. Children sense these things. They do not always understand them, but they sense them. Triss left in midsummer. She had duties elsewhere, other students, responsibilities to the chapter of mages that could not be postponed indefinitely. She promised to return before winter. She left Ciri with books and assignments. She told the girl that she was doing well, that her progress was remarkable, that she should be proud. Ciri nodded and thanked her and felt the isolation of the keep settle back over her like a familiar weight. The Witchers began to depart as well. Lambert left first, heading south toward Temeria where contracts were said to be plentiful. Cohen followed a week later. Traveling east toward Cahir Eskel remained longer, but eventually he too prepared to leave. Only Vesemir and Geralt would stay, and Ciri. The keep felt emptier with just the three of them. The great hall echoed. The training yard seemed too large. At night, when the fire burned low and the shadows grew long, Ciri sometimes imagined she could hear the keep itself breathing. The exhalation of stone and history. The memory of all the boys who had walked these halls and died in the attempt to become something more than human. She wondered if ghosts could be lonely. She wondered if she would become one. Because despite the training, despite the sanctuary, despite everything, Ciri understood that Kaer Morhen was not permanent. It was a pause, a reprieve. Eventually, the world outside would remember she existed. Eventually, those who hunted her would find the trail again. Nilfgaard had not stopped searching. Emperor Emir var Emreis wanted his daughter back. Wanted her for reasons that involved prophecy and power and dynastic ambition. His agents moved through the northern kingdoms, asking questions, following rumors, bribing informants. They had not yet found Kaer Morhen. The mountains were remote, the valley hidden, but time worked against secrecy, and there were other hunters. A fire mage named Rience, who served a master whose identity remained cloaked in shadow. He had already tortured one of Geralt's friends, a bard named Dandelion, trying to extract information about Ciri's whereabouts. He would find others to torture. He would follow every lead, no matter how faint. Bounty hunters who saw in Ciri's capture a fortune large enough to retire on. Political opportunists who understood that controlling the last heir of Cintra meant controlling leverage against Nilfgaard. And furthest away, in dimensions Ciri could not yet conceive, beings who sensed the elder blood and understood what it meant, who remembered when such bloodlines had allowed travel between worlds, who wanted that power for themselves. The NL elves of Tirnalia, the Red Riders, the Wild Hunt. But their time had not yet come. For now, Ciri remained in the mountains, training, learning, growing stronger in body, if not yet in power. The Witchers taught her what they could. The keep protected her as much as broken stone, and isolation could protect anyone. It would have to be enough, because the world did not stop turning. Wars did not pause for one girl's education, and those who hunted her were patient. They could afford to be. Elder blood could not hide forever. By late summer, Ciri could hold a practice sword without her hands blistering. By autumn, she could complete the basic drills without Vesemir correcting every movement. By the time the first snows returned to the mountains, she could almost imagine herself becoming what the Witchers were trying to build. A survivor. Not a Witcher. Never that. The mutations were forbidden to her. But something else. Something undefined. A girl with royal blood and peasant calluses. A princess who knew how to skin rabbits and start fires in the rain. An heir to a destroyed kingdom who could name 47 varieties of monster and describe how to kill each one. Geralt watched her progress and said little. But on the first night of winter, when the snow began to fall and the keep sealed itself against the cold, he sat with her by the fire. They did not speak. They simply existed in the same space, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind howl through the broken towers. It was not family, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. The world beyond the mountains had not grown kinder. 2 years passed in the Blue Mountains. 2 cycles of snow and thaw, of training and study, of mornings that began before dawn and nights that ended with muscles too sore for easy sleep. Ciri grew taller, stronger. The softness of childhood burned away under Vesemir's relentless instruction and the simple brutality of mountain winters. She was 12 when circumstances forced her to leave Kaer Morhen. Not permanently, not by choice, but a Witcher's keep could not remain her entire world, and those who understood the political currents knew that isolation, however safe it felt, was its own kind of danger. The girl needed to understand the kingdom she might one day have claim to, needed to see the world she was being trained to survive in. So Geralt took her south. They traveled with a dwarven merchant company led by Yarpen Zegrin, a warrior trader whose reputation preceded him. Like the smell of sulfur, Yarpen and his kin moved goods along the dangerous trade routes between Mahakam and the human kingdoms, and they moved with enough armed escorts that bandits thought twice before attacking. It was, in theory, safe passage. Theory and practice diverged near the borders of Edirn. The Scoia'tael struck at dawn. Elven guerrillas, remnants of the elder race who had chosen violence over subjugation. They wore green and brown, camouflage that made them nearly invisible in forested terrain. They called themselves squirrels in the elder speech, a name that carried bitter irony. Humans had driven them into the wilderness, had taken their cities and their lands and their dignity. The Scoia'tael fought back with arrows and ambushes, attacking the supply lines that sustained human kingdoms. Yarpen's caravan had been targeted deliberately, not for the goods it carried, which were valuable but not exceptional. The attack had been arranged, a trap set by those who suspected that the cargo included something more precious than dwarven steel. They suspected correctly. Ciri found herself pressed behind an overturned wagon, while arrows sang through the air and men screamed. Geralt fought with the fluid economy of someone who had survived 100 such ambushes. His sword moved faster than Ciri could follow, deflecting projectiles that should have been impossible to see coming. The dwarves formed a defensive line, their axes and hammers meeting elven blades with the ring of steel on steel. The battle was brief. The Scoia'tael melted back into the forest when it became clear the caravan would not fall easily. They left dead on both sides, elves and dwarves, and one human merchant who had been in the wrong place when an arrow found his throat. But they also left confirmation. Someone had known Ciri would be traveling this route. Someone had told the Scoia'tael where to look. The girl's presence was no longer secret. Whatever security obscurity had provided was gone. Geralt made a decision that would echo for years. He could not take Ciri back to Kaer Morhen. The path there would be watched now. Could not keep her with him, as his travels took him through territories where her presence would draw attention like blood and water. Could not trust most of the northern kingdoms, where political factions would use her as leverage in their chess games with Nilfgaard. He brought her to Elander, to the Temple of Melitele, where a priestess named Nenneke maintained a school for girls of noble birth. It was neutral ground, sacred ground. Even Nilfgaard hesitated to violate the sanctity of temples, and Nenneke herself was formidable enough that kings sought her counsel. Ciri would be safe there, or safer, at least, than anywhere else Geralt could imagine. He left her at the temple gates with the same awkward discomfort he had shown since Cintra burned, with promises to return, with assurances that this was temporary, with all the words that adults use when they are leaving children behind, and do not want to admit the leaving might be permanent. Ciri watched him ride away. Again. She had learned by then not to cry. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. So she turned to face the temple to meet the priestess who would be her new keeper, and she locked away the grief where it could not be used against her. This skill would serve her well in the years to come. The Temple of Melitele stood in Elander like a fragment of a gentler age. White stone, gardens that bloomed even in autumn, fountains where water sang in patterns that seemed to carry meaning. The priestesses moved through the halls with quiet purpose, tending to the sick, teaching the young, maintaining traditions that predated the kingdoms currently tearing themselves apart in war. Mother Nenneke ruled the temple with pragmatic compassion. She was old, genuinely old, not the preserved youth that sorceresses maintained through magic. Her face carried every year she had lived, and she had lived through more wars and plagues and political upheavals than most could remember. She looked at Ciri and saw through every defense the girl had constructed. "You're angry," Nenneke said on their first meeting. Ciri denied it. "You should be angry. Anger is appropriate, but you will not bring it into my temple. When you are here, you will learn to be something other than what pain has made you." It was not a request. The temple school taught reading, writing, mathematics, history, and the healing arts. It taught the daughters of nobles how to manage estates, how to navigate court politics, how to appear graceful while carrying the weight of expectation. It did not teach swordplay. It did not train killers. Ciri chafed against the restrictions. She had grown accustomed to physical training, to pushing her body until it broke, and then pushing further. The sedentary life of a temple student felt like imprisonment. She attended lessons. She learned her letters and her figures. She memorized the lineages of dead kings and the proper forms of address for visiting dignitaries. But at night, in the small cell she shared with 2 other girls, she practiced the sword forms Vesemir had drilled into her, invisible blade in hand, moving through the sequences in silence while her roommates slept. She could not let the skills atrophy, because she understood, even if the priestesses did not, that her education in violence was not optional. The world wanted her dead or captured or controlled. Knowing which fork to use at dinner would not save her when the hunters came, and they would come. Months passed in Elander. Spring became summer. Ciri adapted to temple life the way one adapts to a cage, by finding small freedoms within the constraints, by befriending the other girls while never quite trusting them, by learning what the priestesses could teach while keeping the core of herself separate and protected. Mother Nenica watched her with knowing eyes. The old priestess understood that Ciri was not like the other girls, that beneath the noble manners and the diligent study habits lived something feral and dangerous. Nenica had seen it before in soldiers who returned from war. The inability to fully relax, the constant awareness of exits and threats, the expectation that violence would return. She tried to reach the wounded thing inside the girl, through kindness, through patience, through the simple act of providing safety, without demanding anything in return. It worked. Partially, Ciri began to let her guard down in increments, began to speak about Cintra, about her grandmother, about the night the city burned. She did not speak about the power in her blood. That remained locked away even from Nenica's gentle interrogation. Some secrets were too dangerous to share. Some truths would make her more vulnerable, not less. The hunter found her in midsummer. His name was Rience. He was a sorcerer, though not a particularly powerful one by the standards of the chapter of mages. What he lacked in raw ability, he compensated for with cruelty and focus. He specialized in fire magic, which was unusual. Most mages avoided fire spells, as they were difficult to control, and the margin for error resulted in spectacular failures. Rience used fire because he enjoyed watching things burn. He had been searching for Ciri for months. His master, whose identity Ciri would not learn for years, wanted the girl alive, wanted her bloodline, wanted the elder blood for purposes that involved prophecy and power, and plans that stretched decades into the future. Rience served this master with a devotion of a hunting dog. He followed leads. He tortured informants. He left burned corpses in his wake. And he had finally traced the girl to Elander. He did not attack the temple directly. Even Rience understood that violating sacred ground would bring consequences he could not afford. Instead, he waited, watched, learned the patterns of the temple's daily routine, identified when Ciri left the safety of consecrated ground. She went to the market sometimes with other students, buying supplies for the temple kitchens. She attended festivals in the town square. She was not a prisoner, after all. The priestesses believed in teaching their charges how to move through the world, not how to hide from it. Rience struck when Ciri was separated from her group. A moment of inattention, a crowd that shifted. Suddenly, she was alone in an alley, and the sorcerer was there, his hands already glowing with the dull red of gathering fire magic, his scarred face, a gift from an earlier duel with Yennefer of Vengerberg, twisted into something between a smile and a snarl. "Cirilla," he said. The name was a statement, confirmation, victory. Ciri ran. She had no other option. She was unarmed, untrained in magic, 12 years old and alone. She ran through streets she barely knew, past shopkeepers who saw nothing unusual in a girl fleeing, into alleys that deadened into walls and courtyards that offered no escape. Rience followed with the patience of someone who knew the prey was already caught. He hurled fire casually, small bolts that blackened stone and set awnings aflame, not trying to kill her, just hurting her, driving her toward whatever trap he had prepared. Ciri's heart hammered. Her breath came in gasps. The training from Kaer Morhen felt distant and useless. She had learned to fight with swords, not to evade sorcerers, had learned monster ecology, not urban escape routes. She stumbled, fell, scrambled back to her feet, and then something inside her broke open. The power in her blood, dormant for years, activated. It was not controlled, not directed. It was pure panic made manifest. A scream that had no voice but traveled through dimensions that human senses could not perceive. Reality fractured around her. Space folded. And Ciri was elsewhere. Not far. Only a dozen streets away, in a market square crowded with midday shoppers. But the distance was not the point. The impossibility was the point. She had teleported. Ciri stood in the market, disoriented and shaking, with no memory of how she had arrived. One moment, she had been trapped in an alley with fire closing in. The next, she was here, safe, surrounded by people who saw nothing unusual in a disheveled girl catching her breath. Rience materialized at the edge of the square. Minutes later, he searched the crowd with eyes that blazed with frustration. He had felt the surge of power, had recognized it for what it was. The girl had manifested, but she was untrained, which meant the next activation would be just as uncontrolled, which meant she remained vulnerable. He would find her again, but not today. The temple guards arrived, alerted by witnesses who had seen the fires in the alley. Mother Nenneke herself came, her face set in an expression that promised consequences for whoever had dared threaten one of her charges. Rience withdrew before confrontation became inevitable. He could afford patience. The girl would slip up eventually. They always did. That night, Ciri told Mother Nenneke what had happened. Not everything. Not the teleportation, which Ciri herself did not fully understand, but the attack, the sorcerer, the realization that her presence endangered everyone in the temple. Nenneke listened without interruption. When Ciri finished, the old priestess was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You will leave tomorrow." Not a suggestion, not a debate. "Where will I go?" Ciri asked. "I don't know, but you cannot stay here. Not if hunters know to look in Elender. The temple's sanctity will protect you only until someone desperate enough decides that political consequences are worth bearing." "I'm sorry," Ciri whispered. "Don't be sorry. Be alive. That's the only thing that matters." Nenneke made arrangements. She contacted Geralt through methods Ciri did not fully understand. She gathered supplies. She found a merchant caravan heading east that would take Ciri as far as Oxenfurt, where other protections might be arranged. She did all of this in less than a day, which spoke to the networks and resources the temple commanded when necessity demanded it. Ciri left Elender before dawn. She did not say goodbye to the other girls, did not pack anything beyond what could fit in a travel satchel. She simply walked out of the temple gates with a merchant she had never met, wearing clothes that marked her as a servant rather than a student, becoming anonymous again, becoming no one. It was a skill she would need. The months that followed blurred together into a sequence of temporary sanctuaries and narrow escapes. Ciri moved through the northern kingdoms like a ghost, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a trace, never using her real name, never trusting anyone completely. She learned to lie convincingly, to steal when necessary, to recognize the signs of pursuit before hunters closed in. She also learned she was not the only one running. The Second Northern War had shattered the already fragile stability of the region. Nilfgaard pushed north again. Taking territory that had been lost in the first conflict, refugees fled the fighting in waves. Bandits and deserters preyed on the vulnerable. The Scoia'tael intensified their attacks, seeing opportunity in the chaos. Ciri was one refugee among thousands. She worked where she could, serving girl in taverns, stable hand at inns, field worker during harvest. The labor was hard, but it provided cover. No one looked twice at dirty children working for coin and food. She kept her head down. She listened to conversations that might warn her of hunters. She moved on when instinct told her to move. Months became a year. She turned 13 on the road, though she did not mark the day. Birthdays seemed like relics from a life that no longer existed. She was too busy surviving to mourn the passage of time. Geralt found her twice during this period. Once in a village near the Pontar River, where he had tracked her through a combination of rumor and the distinctive trail of incidents that followed her. They spent 3 days together. He assessed her health, her state of mind, her ability to continue running. He gave her money, taught her additional tricks for staying hidden. Then he left again, because his presence drew attention, and attention was the last thing she needed. The second time was in the forests of Temeria. She had fallen in with a group of refugees fleeing a Scoia'tael raid. Geralt appeared like a specter, verified she was unharmed, and disappeared again before she could ask him the questions that haunted her: why he kept leaving, why he never stayed, why destiny meant abandonment. Children do not understand that sometimes love manifests as distance, that sometimes the greatest protection is to be absent when the hunters come looking. Ciri was 14 when she encountered the rats. They found her in the ruins of a burned village. She had been traveling alone for weeks, avoiding the main roads where armies and bandits operated with impunity. The village had been destroyed recently. Bodies still lay in the streets, not yet buried. Smoke rose from collapsed roofs. The survivors had fled or been taken. Ciri was searching for food when they rode into the square. 5 young people on horses, armed, dangerous. They wore mismatched armor scavenged from corpses and carried weapons taken from the same source. They looked like bandits because that was what they were, but they were young bandits, none of them older than 20, all of them running from something. Their leader called himself Giselher. He was perhaps 17, with the kind of face that inspired trust before it should. He looked at Ciri standing in the ruins and seemed to see something that interested him. Not prey, not a victim, something else. "You alone?" he asked. Ciri nodded. "Where's your family? Dead? Recent?" "No." Giselher studied her. "You've been on the road a while." It was not a question, but Ciri answered anyway. "Yes." "Can you fight?" "Some." "Steal?" "When I have to." Giselher smiled. "What's your name?" Ciri hesitated. She had used many names over the past year, none of them her own. She reached for one now, but something made her stop. These people were outlaws outside society's structure, outside the reach of kingdoms and their politics. Maybe that meant she could be honest. "Falka," she said. Not entirely a lie. Falka had been an ancient princess who had burned half the north in rebellion centuries ago. A girl remembered for violence and madness. The name felt appropriate for what Ciri was becoming. Giselher seemed to accept it. "All right, Falka, you can ride with us if you want. We're not much, but we take care of our own." The others nodded. Missel, the only other girl in the group, perhaps 16 with hard eyes and a harder smile. Kaylee, youngest of them all, barely 15 himself, Assi, who barely spoke but watched everything. Reef, built like a blacksmith and twice as strong. They called themselves the Rats, not because of the name's dignity, but because rats survived. Rats thrived in the ruins humans left behind. Rats were beneath notice until they weren't, and by then it was too late. Ciri rode with them, not because she liked them, not because she trusted them, but because being alone was its own kind of death, and these outcasts asked no questions about her past. They accepted Falka at face value, accepted that she was running from something, accepted that she had skills unusual for a girl her age. They taught her the rest: how to rob without getting caught, how to pick targets worth the risk, how to disappear into forests when pursuit grew hot, how to kill when killing became necessary. The Rats were not idealists. They stole to survive. They killed when survival demanded it. They showed no mercy to those who showed them none first. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ciri found herself adopting their morality. It was easier than the alternative. Easier than carrying the weight of nobility and responsibility and all the expectations that came with being the last heir of Cintra. As Falka, she was no one. As Falka, she could be brutal without guilt, could take what she needed without apology, could become something sharp and dangerous instead of something wounded and vulnerable. Missel took particular interest in her. The older girls seemed to recognize something of herself in Ciri. a kindred spirit, someone else who had been broken by the world and rebuilt themselves into something harder. They became close in ways that confused Ciri at first, then comforted her, then complicated her in ways she did not yet have language to describe. The rats became family, dysfunctional, violent, doomed, but family nonetheless. They lasted 8 months. 8 months of riding and stealing and sleeping under stars. 8 months of close calls and narrow escapes. 8 months of Ciri learning that she could hurt people and not feel remorse, that she could watch Giselher kill a merchant who fought back and feel nothing but relief that they had gotten away. 8 months of becoming someone she would later struggle to recognize. The end came in a town whose name Ciri never learned. They had robbed a merchant convoy. A simple job: take the goods, leave the guards alive if possible, disappear before law enforcement arrived, standard procedure. But one of the merchants had been connected to more powerful people than the rats had realized. He hired Leo Bonhart. Bonhart was not a sorcerer or a soldier. He was simply a man who killed for money and did it exceptionally well. He collected Witcher medallions as trophies, which told you everything about his capabilities. Witchers were nearly impossible to kill. Bonhart had killed 3. He tracked the rats to an inn outside the town. He came at night when they were drunk and confident and careless. He came through the door with a sword in each hand and murder in his eyes, and he killed them. All of them. Giselher died first, throat opened before he could draw his weapon. Kaylee next, gutted while reaching for a knife. Ass managed to get a blade out, but Bonhart was faster. Reef's size meant nothing. Bonhart cut him down like timber. Missile lasted longest. She fought. She screamed Ciri's name. She bought seconds with her life. Precious seconds that allowed Ciri to reach the window and smash through it into the alley beyond. Ciri ran. Behind her, she heard Missile die. The sound would echo in her nightmares for years. Bonhart pursued. Not immediately. He took time to confirm the kills, to search the room for evidence, to collect payment from the merchant who had hired him. But then he came after the one who had escaped, because Leo Bonhart always finished contracts. Ciri fled through forests and across rivers, and into territories she did not know. She stole another horse, rode it until it collapsed. Stole another, kept moving because stopping meant dying. Bonhart caught her anyway. He was a hunter. This was what he did. And Ciri, despite her training, despite her time with the rats, was still just a girl who had been running too long. He cornered her in the ruins of an old tower. She drew her sword, a blade she had taken from one of the rats after they died, and faced him with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. They fought. It was not a duel. It was an education in the difference between training and mastery. Bonhart was not fast like Geralt, was not precise like Vesemir. He was simply experienced. He knew every trick Ciri tried before she attempted it. He anticipated every attack, parried every strike, and when he had demonstrated the futility of her resistance, he disarmed her with a twist of his wrist that broke 2 of her fingers. Ciri fell. Bonhart stood over her with his sword at her throat. "Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon," he said. "You're worth more alive, but don't test me." He bound her wrists, threw her onto his horse, rode south toward whoever had paid for her capture. Ciri's time running with the rats was over. Her time in chains was beginning. Leo Bonhart kept Ciri alive because dead princesses were worth less than living ones. He did not keep her comfortable. The journey south took weeks. Bonhart traveled at a pace calculated to avoid pursuit while maintaining his captive's value. Ciri rode with her hands bound, her broken fingers splinted with rough efficiency. He fed her enough to prevent starvation, allowed her enough rest to prevent collapse, treated her like livestock being brought to market, which was essentially what she had become. He also made her fight, not immediately. First, he let the injuries from their encounter heal, let the broken fingers knit back together under the crude splint, let the bruises fade. He had plans for the girl, and those plans required her to be functional. When sufficient time had passed, Bonhart took her to a town whose name she never learned and brought her to a building at its edge, an arena, not the grand coliseums of Nilfgaard, where thousands gathered to watch professional gladiators die for entertainment. This was something smaller, cruder, a fighting pit where local toughs proved their worth and wealthy spectators wagered on the outcomes. Blood sport for provincial appetites. Bonhart threw Ciri into a cell beneath the arena floor. "You'll fight tomorrow," he he said. "Win or die, I profit either way." The cell contained 2 other prisoners, both women, both older than Ciri, neither interested in conversation. They had the look of people who had given up on survival and were simply waiting for the end. Ciri did not sleep that night. She sat in the darkness and assessed her situation with the cold calculation that time with the rats had taught her. She had a sword. Bonhart had allowed her that much, as fighters without weapons made for poor entertainment. She had training from Kaer Morhen. She had months of real violence behind her now, not just practice, but she had never killed in formal combat. The rats' violence had been ambushes and quick strikes. This would be different, face to face, deliberate, with an audience watching to see if she had the will to survive. Morning came. Guards dragged the 3 women from the cell, upstairs worn smooth by decades of condemned feet, through a gate that opened onto sand that had soaked up more blood than rain, into light that hurt after hours in darkness. The arena was perhaps 50 paces across. Wooden walls rose to waist height, then open air, where spectators crowded onto benches. Perhaps 200 people, enough to make noise, enough to create the illusion of importance. Ciri's opponents were released from the opposite gate. 3 men, armed with swords and axes. They had the look of criminals given a choice between execution and fighting. They had chosen fighting. Now they would try to earn their freedom by killing the women Bonhart had provided for entertainment. The crowd roared. The fight began. It was not elegant, not like the training bouts at Kaer Morhen, where Vesemir corrected form and emphasized technique. This was survival rendered down to its essence. The men came at them with a desperate fury of people who understood this was their only chance. One of the women died in the first minute, an axe to the chest. She fell without ceremony. The other woman lasted longer, but not much. A sword through the gut. She collapsed, screaming. The crowd cheered. Ciri faced 3 men alone. They circled her, testing, looking for weakness. They saw a girl, young, small. They assumed easy prey. The first man who lunged at her lost that assumption along with his life. Ciri moved the way Vesemir had taught her, the way Geralt had demonstrated. Fast, precise. Her blade found the gap between the man's ribs before he understood he was dead. He fell. The crowd's cheers shifted from anticipation to surprise. The second man came more carefully. He was older, more experienced. He recognized trained movement when he saw it. He approached with his guard up, his sword positioned defensively. But defense was not enough against someone who had been drilled by witchers. Ciri feinted high, struck low. The man's knee buckled. She finished him before he hit the sand. The third man dropped his weapon. He raised his hands in surrender, begged for mercy, asked the crowd to spare him. The crowd wanted blood. They chanted, screamed, demanded the kill. Bonhart sat in the stands, watching, waiting to see what the girl would do. Ciri looked at the unarmed man, looked at the crowd, looked at Bonhart. She understood what was being asked, understood that mercy here was weakness, that weakness would be punished, that Bonhart was testing her, not her skill. He already knew she could fight. He was testing her capacity for cruelty, her willingness to become what this world demanded. She killed the third man. Not quickly, not cleanly, but she killed him. The crowd roared its approval. Bonhart smiled. The arena became Ciri's life. Bonhart brought her to different towns, different pits, different opponents, sometimes criminals, sometimes slaves. Once, horrifyingly, a young boy barely older than Kaylee had been Ciri fought them all, killed most of them, survived. She stopped counting the dead after the first dozen, stopped learning their names, stopped seeing them as people. They became obstacles, threats to eliminate. That was the only way to endure it, to fragment herself, to become Falca when she stepped into the arena, to bury Ciri so deep that the killing could not touch who she had been. But the killing touched her anyway. At night, in whatever cell Bonhart locked her in, she dreamed of faces, of the boy who had cried for his mother, of the woman who had fought with a broken arm, of the old man who had died with dignity. They haunted her, built up like sediment until she could barely breathe under the weight. Bonhart kept her sharp through cruelty. He would withhold food if she fought poorly. would add iron weights to her wrists and ankles, forcing her to train with the burden until her muscles adapted, would describe in clinical detail exactly how he had killed the witchers whose medallions he carried, emphasizing that she was nothing special, that her training meant nothing, that she lived only because he allowed it. He also taught her, not out of kindness, out of pragmatism. A fighter who survived longer generated more profit. So Bonhart drilled her in techniques she had not learned at Kaer Morhen dirty fighting. How to use terrain, how to exploit an opponent's exhaustion, how to kill efficiently rather than elegantly. Ciri absorbed these lessons with the same numb focus she brought to everything now. She was a weapon being sharpened, nothing more. Months passed in this hell. She turned 15 in some nameless town, fighting in some nameless arena, killing someone whose name she never learned. There was no celebration, no acknowledgement, just another day of blood and sand and crowds that cheered for death. She began to understand that this might be her entire life, that she might die here, not in one dramatic battle, but through simple attrition, the accumulation of small wounds, the erosion of will, the moment when she simply stopped fighting back and let the next opponent end it. She thought about that sometimes, about how easy it would be to let go, but something in her refused, some stubborn fragment of Calanthe's granddaughter, some memory of Geralt walking away but always returning, some echo of Vesemir's voice saying that survival was the only victory that mattered. She kept fighting. The rescue came from an unexpected direction. Not a rescue, precisely. An opportunity. Bonhart's operation was not as isolated as he believed. He had business with others, mercenaries and spies who operated in the shadows of the war. One such meeting brought Ciri into proximity with people whose loyalties were more complex than they appeared. The details of how she escaped would later become confused in retellings. What remained clear was this. Bonhart's hold on her broke, briefly, violently. She ran. Not far at first. Pursuit came immediately. Bonhart was a hunter who did not lose prey easily. But Ciri had learned during her captivity, had watched, had waited. And when the moment came, she moved. The chase led across winter landscape, frozen ground, dead vegetation, and eventually a lake locked in ice. The surface stretched white and treacherous beneath clouds that promised snow. Ciri had found ice skates in her flight, old things, belonging to someone long dead. She laced them with shaking hands and struck out across the frozen expanse. Behind her, her pursuers hesitated. The ice was uncertain, their horses too heavy. They would have to follow on foot, and Ciri could move faster on the skates than they could walk. She gained distance, gained precious seconds. Fog rolled across the lake, thick, sudden, as if summoned. It swallowed Ciri completely, swallowed the pursuing figures, reduced the world to white silence and the sound of blades cutting ice. And then she saw it, rising from the fog like a memory made solid. A tower, ancient, elven, impossible. The Tower of Swallow. It had many names in many languages. Tor Ziriel in the Elder speech. A way station from the age before the conjunction. A place where the barriers between worlds grew thin enough to pierce it existed in folklore and fragmentary records. Most believed it mythical. It stood before her. Ciri did not question, did not hesitate. She skated toward it as shouts echoed behind her through the fog. Voices demanding she stop. Threats, promises of what would happen if she was caught. She reached the tower's base. Stairs rose into mist. She climbed. Behind her, the ice cracked. Someone had tried to follow, and the frozen surface betrayed them. Screams splashing. Then silence as the fog absorbed all sound. Ciri climbed higher. The tower should have been a ruin, should have been crumbling stone and empty chambers. Instead, she found it intact, pristine, as if time had not touched it, or as if time moved differently here. At the tower's heart, she found what she had been seeking without knowing she sought it. A chamber, empty save for markings on the floor, elven script that hurt to look at directly. The air itself felt charged. This was a nexus point where reality grew thin. Ciri stood at the center, closed her eyes, reached for the power that lived in her blood. Not with panic this time, not with terror, but with deliberate intention. She visualized crossing, visualized piercing the veil between worlds. The power responded. It erupted not smoothly, but with violence. The door in her blood did not open. It shattered. Reality screamed. Space folded. The tower, the lake, the fog, the world itself fell away. And Ciri fell through the gap between dimensions, into colors that had no names, through spaces that existed between spaces. Time lost meaning. Distance became abstraction. She tumbled through the void that separated world from world, with no control over direction or destination. The elder blood sang in her veins. This was what it had been designed for. This crossing, this impossible navigation of the spaces between realities. Her ancestors had walked these paths deliberately, had stepped between worlds as easily as crossing thresholds. Ciri simply fell. She had no teacher, no guide. The power had activated without direction, and now she plummeted through dimensions like debris in a storm. Fragmentary images flickered past. A world of endless ocean, a world of red sand beneath green sky, a world dying, its sun guttering, a world where cities grew like crystals, a world consumed by ice. And in the darkness between worlds, she sensed them. Riders. They moved through the void with purpose she lacked. They knew these paths, had ridden them for centuries, and they had felt her crossing, had sensed the signature of elder blood tearing through dimensions. The wild hunt had found its quarry, but Ciri was already falling away, already tumbling toward a world that pulled at her with gravity her blood recognized. She could not stop the descent, could not change direction, could only hold on as reality solidified around her and the crossing ended. She struck ground, not gently. The impact drove air from her lungs and sent pain lancing through ribs that might have cracked. She lay gasping on stone that was smooth and cold and unmistakably artificial elven construction. She knew the feel of it now. When her vision cleared, she found herself in a place she did not recognize. A plaza, vast, empty, surrounded by towers that reached toward a sky that was the wrong color. Too blue, too perfect, like someone had tried to paint heaven and gotten the proportions wrong. This was not her world. She had succeeded in crossing, had done what the power in her blood made possible, had stepped between dimensions, and had arrived somewhere that smelled of threat. Footsteps approached. Ciri rolled to her feet despite the pain, reached for her sword, found the blade had not made the crossing with her. She was unarmed in an unknown world with unknown dangers approaching. A figure emerged from behind one of the towers. An elf, not one of the Unsaid elves who lived on the continent. This one was taller, more refined, with features that suggested ages beyond human reckoning. He wore robes of fabric that shimmered with colors that hurt to look at directly. He studied Ciri with eyes that held ancient knowledge. "Lara Dorren's child," he said in accented common speech. "We have been waiting for you." What followed would shape years of Ciri's life. The world she had fallen into was Tir na Lia, capital of the NL. The elves who greeted her were not enemies, they claimed. Were not captors, were merely family reclaiming what had been lost when Lara Dorren chose a human lover over her own people. They lied, but Ciri did not understand this immediately. She was exhausted, injured, disoriented from the crossing, and they offered sanctuary, food healing, all the things she desperately needed. She accepted. It was a mistake that would cost her months of her life. The NL wanted her blood, wanted her ability, wanted to breed her like livestock to restore what their people had lost. They spoke of duty and destiny and the debts owed by descendants to ancestors. They spoke beautifully, poetically. They did not speak truthfully. Ciri would learn this, would escape their golden prison with help from unexpected sources, would master her power through trial and terror and the guidance of beings who existed outside the conflicts of elves and humans. But those tales belonged to journeys not yet chronicled here. The routes that carried Cirilla across worlds were not singular. There were dozens of crossings, hundreds of narrow escapes, thousands of moments when the choice between survival and surrender hung in balance. She fled burning Cintra as a child who understood nothing of what moved in her blood. She found temporary sanctuary among dryads who sensed her otherness, but could not name it. She trained in mountain keeps where witchers taught her to survive. She killed in arenas where human life was measured in entertainment value. She learned philosophy from hermits who asked nothing in return for kindness. And eventually, she learned to walk between worlds. Not safely, not easily, but deliberately. The power that had erupted in panic and terror gradually became something she could shape, could direct. The crossing that had been falling became navigation. She learned the feel of different dimensions, learned to sense where the walls grew thin enough to pierce, learned to leave traces that confused those who hunted her across realities. The wild hunt pursued her through worlds beyond counting. They were patient. They were ancient. They understood that time meant nothing when hunting across dimensions. They would wait at crossroads between realities, would ambush her in worlds where she paused to rest, would harry her from dimension to dimension until exhaustion made her vulnerable. But Ciri kept moving, because that was what she had learned in all those years of running. That survival meant motion, that stopping meant death, that the moment you believed yourself safe was the moment the hunters closed in. She became legend in worlds she barely visited. A girl with ashen hair who appeared and vanished like smoke, who walked through walls that should have been solid, who left frost in her wake from the dimensional cold that clung to her crossings. Some worlds named her savior, others called her demon. Most simply whispered of the girl who could not be caught. The northern kingdoms continued their wars without her. Nilfgaard expanded. The Scoia'tael fought their losing battle against human dominance. Mages played their games of power in towers that scraped clouds. None of it touched Ciri directly. She had stepped outside that entire reality. But her absence created ripples. Geralt searched. Yennefer searched. They followed rumors and fragments. They pieced together the trail of her flight from Bonhart, her recovery with Visigota, her disappearance into the tower. They understood eventually that she had crossed, that the girl with elder blood had done what such bloodlines made possible, that she was alive somewhere in the infinite realities that pressed against each other like soap bubbles. But alive in another dimension was functionally the same as dead to those who could not follow. They could not follow, so they waited and hoped and continued living in a world that felt emptier for her absence. The paths between worlds were not empty. Others walked them. Other beings who predated the conjunction of the spheres, who remembered when travel between dimensions was common, who existed in the gaps between realities because they belonged to none of them completely. Ciri encountered these beings on her journeys. Unicorns, though not the horned horses of human legend. These were creatures of pure thought and ancient power. They moved between worlds as easily as breathing. They fought wars against the NL that spanned dimensions and epochs, and they took interest in the girl who carried Lara Dorren's legacy. One in particular, a unicorn whose name translated roughly as Ihuaraquax, little horse. In the language Ciri would learn to speak with creatures who did not use words the way humans understood them. He found her in a desert world where she had collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration, found her dying beneath alien stars, found her power burning itself out in uncontrolled manifestations that threatened to tear her apart from inside. He taught her, not with words, with something deeper, mind to mind, concept to concept. He showed her how Elder Blood was meant to work, how to channel the power consciously instead of letting it erupt, how to see the structure of reality clearly enough to find the thin places, how to step through dimensions without falling. The teaching took time measured in worlds visited rather than days passed. Ciri walked beside the unicorn through realities that defied description, learned the geography of the multiverse, learned which worlds were safe for brief visits and which would kill her in minutes, learned to sense the approach of the wild hunt before they arrived, learned, finally, to control what she carried. The power stopped being a curse that activated in crisis, became instead a tool she could choose to use. The door in her blood no longer required terror to open. She could turn the handle deliberately, could step through with intention rather than desperation. She became what her bloodline had been shaped to produce, a walker between worlds, an heir to Lara Dorren's legacy, a girl who could go anywhere the fabric of reality permitted. But with power came understanding that what she carried was dangerous, that opening gates between worlds could have consequences beyond her personal survival, that the Wild Hunt wanted her not just for breeding, but because elder blood in sufficient quantity could tear down the barriers between dimensions entirely, could allow invasions, could permit the NL to flood into the human world with armies, could enable the conquest they had been planning for centuries. Ciri understood she was not just a refugee, she was a key, a weapon, a potential catastrophe wrapped in the flesh of a girl who wanted nothing more than to go home. But home had become a complicated concept. The continent where she was born felt distant now. She had walked through so many worlds that her original reality seemed like one choice among infinite options. She could return. The power in her blood made that possible. But returning meant bringing everything that hunted her back to the world she loved, meant putting Geralt and Yennefer and everyone else in the path of forces that operated beyond human scale. So she stayed away. Not forever, not permanently, but long enough to learn, long enough to master what she carried, long enough that when she finally did return, she would come back as something more than a frightened girl running from hunters. She would return as someone who understood the spaces between worlds, who could walk the hidden roads deliberately, who carried elder blood not as a burden, but as a birthright finally claimed. The roots that carried Cirilla across worlds were secret not because she hid them deliberately, but because they existed in dimensions most beings could not perceive. They were the paths Lara Dorren had walked when elves still commanded such travel. The routes the NL had used before unicorns closed the gates, the hidden roads that connected reality to reality, like threads in cloth too vast to comprehend. Ciri learned them all. Every shortcut, every dangerous crossing, every world where she could pause safely, and every dimension where stopping meant death. She mapped the multiverse in her blood and bone and memory. And eventually, carrying all this knowledge, bearing all this power, she made the choice to return. Not because the hunting had stopped. The Wild Hunt still pursued. Nilfgaard still searched. Vilgefortz and his agents still wanted her blood for their own purposes, but because running forever was its own kind of death, because she was tired of being hunted, because somewhere in the infinite realities, there was a world that had once been home, where a witcher with amber eyes had claimed her through ancient law, where a sorceress with violet eyes had taught her magic, where a broken fortress in the mountains held memories of training and safety. That world was worth returning to, worth fighting for, worth the risk. So Ciri stepped back through the veil between worlds, back to the continent, back to the northern kingdoms and their wars and their politics and all the complications of a reality where humans and elves and dwarves coexisted in uneasy tension. She returned changed, not just older, though years had passed in the crossing, changed in ways that went deeper than age. She had walked between worlds, had learned what her blood made possible, had become what generations of elven breeding had aimed to create. A living bridge between realities. The girl with elder blood who could go anywhere, who had hidden in every world the multiverse offered, and who chose, finally, to stop hiding. The chronicles of what followed, the reunions and betrayals, the final confrontations with those who had hunted her, the resolution of debts and destinies, belong to other tellings. This account concerns itself only with the roots themselves, the hidden paths that carried a child fleeing burning Cintra across landscapes that defied geography, through forests that remembered when elves ruled, through mountain keeps where monsters were made, through arenas where humanity's cruelty took tangible form, through towers that connected worlds, through dimensions that existed between the spaces humans called real. Elder blood in hiding did not stay hidden forever. It learned instead to walk openly through places where others could not follow, to turn the curse of being hunted into the power of going anywhere, to become not the prey everyone assumed, but something altogether more dangerous, a girl who could leave any trap, a princess who belonged to no kingdom, a walker of worlds who carried in her veins the power to reshape what walls between realities meant. Cirilla Fiona Elen Riannon, the lion cub of Cintra, the child of elder blood, the one who learned that the only sanctuary that lasted was the ability to walk away from every world that proved too dangerous to inhabit. She is still walking, still crossing, still carrying in her blood the legacy of Lara Dorren and the possibility of travel that most beings cannot conceive. The roots remain secret, not because they are hidden, but because they exist in dimensions beyond maps, in the blood, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the terrible freedom of being able to leave anywhere and arrive everywhere. For those who have followed these chronicles to their ending, who wish to understand more about the worlds the Elder Blood touches, more stories wait in the archive of this channel. Knowledge shared becomes knowledge preserved.